Case 1. Andreas Lubitz. The evidence that defined the final moments of Germanwings. Flight 9525 came from a source that investigators initially hoped would reveal a mechanical failure, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR. What it revealed instead was a chilling, rhythmic silence. Eyewitness testimony is impossible at 38,000 feet. But the witness in this case was the flight's captain, Patrick Sondenheimer, whose desperate attempts to break back into the cockpit were captured in high-priority audio. He wasn't just knocking. He was using an emergency axe to hack through a door designed to withstand a terrorist attack. Inside, the man who had locked him out, 27-year-old First Officer Andreas Lubitz, sat in total silence. He didn't scream, he didn't pray, and he didn't explain. He simply breathed, a steady, calm respiration that continued until the moment the Airbus A320 slammed into the French Alps at 430 miles per hour. Lubitz became the face of a modern aviation nightmare, the pilot who used his cockpit as a pressurized tomb for 149 innocent passengers and crew. Andreas Günther Lubitz was born on December 18, 1987 in Montabaur, West Germany, the son of a business executive and a piano teacher. Raised in an affluent environment, he was a quiet young man, obsessed with flight from childhood, beginning with a local glider club. He eventually earned a coveted spot in the Lufthansa flight training school in Bremen. However, behind the professional veneer of a competent pilot was a crumbling psychological interior. Lubitz had a documented history of severe depression and suicidal tendencies dating back to 2008, which had previously interrupted his training. By early 2015, he was spiraling again, haunted by a psychosomatic vision problem, a perceived detached retina that multiple doctors could find no physical evidence of. He was terrified that this perceived blindness would permanently end his career, leading him to seek treatment from at least 5 different doctors. The months before the crash, on the morning of March 24, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 departed Barcelona, bound for Düsseldorf. The flight was routine until the aircraft reached its cruising altitude. At 10:30 a.m., Captain Sondenheimer left the cockpit to use the restroom, leaving Lubitz alone at the controls. The moment the door clicked shut, Lubitz engaged the electronic lock override, a security feature implemented post-9/11 to prevent unauthorized entry. He then manually adjusted the flight management system, dialing the selected altitude from 38,000 feet down to just 100 feet. The aircraft immediately began a steady, controlled descent. As Marseille Air Traffic Control frantically attempted to hail the cockpit via radio, Lubitz remained unresponsive, his breathing recorded as eerily calm despite the chaos unfolding on the other side of the reinforced door. The captain's return to the cockpit door marked the beginning of an 8-minute struggle. Sondenheimer can be heard on the CVR, first knocking politely, then pounding, and finally shouting, "For God's sake, open the door!" When he realized the lock had been manually overridden, he retrieved an emergency axe and a crowbar, attempting to hack through the carbon fiber paneling. Inside, Lubitz did not flinch. He did not alter the plane's course or acknowledge the alarms. The terrain and sink rate warnings began to blare, filling the cockpit with a synthetic chorus of doom. The passengers, unaware of the struggle until the very end, were recorded screaming in unison only in the final seconds before the aircraft struck a mountain ridge in the Massif des Trois Évêchés. Following the crash, forensic investigators shifted their focus to Lubitz's home and personal electronics. They found a digital trail that acted as a blueprint for mass murder. His tablet revealed recent searches for cockpit door security, bipolarity, and ways to commit suicide. Most disturbingly, the flight data recorder, FDR, revealed that Lubitz had performed a rehearsal on the outbound leg from Dusseldorf to Barcelona that same morning. While the captain was briefly away during that flight, Lubitz had dialed the altitude down to 100 feet 5 times in quick succession, resetting it each time before Sondenheimer returned. He was testing the system to ensure that once he made his final move, the autopilot would not prevent the descent. The medical evidence was equally damning. In Lubitz's apartment, investigators found a series of torn-up, unfit to work notes from his doctors, including one that should have grounded him on the very day of the crash. Lubitz had deliberately deceived Lufthansa, fearing that disclosing his mental health struggles would result in the loss of his pilot's license. The administrative fog created by European medical privacy laws allowed him to hide his condition from his employers, who had no legal way to access his private psychiatric records. This systemic failure meant that a man in the midst of a psychotic, depressive episode was given sole control over the lives of 149 people. Andreas Lubitz died at the crash site, leaving no one to face a criminal trial. However, the legal and structural fallout changed global aviation protocols. Lufthansa and its subsidiary Germanwings faced massive civil litigation, eventually paying over 112 million euros in compensation. The tragedy forced an immediate implementation of the two-person rule across Europe and many parts of the world, mandating that 2 authorized crew members must be present in the cockpit at all times to prevent a single individual from seizing control. Lubitz's actions exposed a critical vulnerability in aviation security: that the greatest threat to a flight isn't always someone trying to get into the cockpit, but sometimes the person already sitting inside it. Today, a memorial sculpture called Le Solaire stands near the crash site in the French Alps. It consists of 149 gold-plated elements, each representing a life lost to Lubitz's internal darkness. The investigation serves as a permanent case study in the intersection of mental health and professional responsibility. It highlighted the need for a culture where pilots can seek help without the immediate fear of career termination, while also ensuring that airlines have the oversight necessary to protect the public. Andreas Lubitz remains the most high-profile instance of pilot suicide murder, a chilling reminder of the devastating power one person holds when they decide that their end should also be the end for everyone in their care. Case 2. Gamil al-Batouti. The investigation into EgyptAir Flight 990 turned into a decade-long diplomatic fog, where the mechanical facts of a crash were obscured by a systemic denial of human intent. On October 31st, 1999, a Boeing 767 plunged into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 217 people on board. To the American NTSB, it was a clear-cut case of pilot sabotage. To the Egyptian government, it was an administrative insult that they fought to rebrand as a mechanical fluke. The forensic breadcrumb that defined the case was an elevator fight, a literal physical struggle between 2 pilots for control of the aircraft's tail. At the center of this infrastructure of betrayal was 59-year-old Relief First Officer Gamil al-Batouti, a man who utilized a dark night over the open sea to execute a final, repetitive ritual. Gamil al-Batouti was a senior command first officer, a veteran of the Egyptian Air Force, and a chameleon of professional respectability. To his colleagues, he was a devout family man working extra shifts to fund his daughter's medical treatments in the United States. However, behind this mask of the elder, al-Batouti was facing an administrative death. During layovers in New York, he had been repeatedly reported for moral turpitude, specifically inappropriate behavior toward hotel staff. Just hours before the flight, a high-ranking EgyptAir executive informed al-Battuti that his conduct had reached a breaking point and that this would be his final flight to the U.S. For a man of his cultural and professional standing, this was a social execution that he was unwilling to survive. Flight 990 departed JFK under the cover of a routine red-eye, but al-Battuti had already begun his technical manipulation. He specifically requested to take over the relief shift earlier than scheduled, positioning himself to be alone at the controls. When Captain Ahmed El-Habashi left the cockpit to use the restroom, al-Battuti didn't just fly the plane. He initiated a manual erasure. He disconnected the autopilot and whispered the phrase, "Tawakkaltu ala Allah," I rely on God, before pushing the control column into a steep 40-degree dive. He repeated the phrase 11 times, a calm, rhythmic chant that the CVR recorded as the plane accelerated toward the ocean's surface. The technical struggle that followed was a masterpiece of structural desecration. When Captain El-Habashi rushed back into the cockpit, he found a scene of cognitive dissonance. He pulled back on his controls to save the plane, but al-Battuti was simultaneously pushing forward to ensure its destruction. This elevator fight put the Boeing 767 into a state of aerodynamic self-destruction. As the captain shouted, "What is this? Did you shut the engines?" al-Battuti reached over and moved the fuel levers to cut off, effectively silencing the aircraft's power and sealing the fate of the 217 souls on board. The institutional failure of the EgyptAir case was the refusal of the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority to accept the psychological evidence. They branded the NTSB's suicide theory as a cultural attack, preferring to blame a hypothetical mechanical failure in the tail's power control units. This administrative denial allowed the Egyptian government to protect the airline's reputation at the cost of the truth. It was a forensic buffer created by national pride, which ignored the fact that al-Battuti had spoken his prayer before any mechanical alarm had sounded, indicating intent rather than a reaction to an emergency. Al-Battuti's premeditation was shielded by the aviation medical fog of the late 90s. At 59, he was facing mandatory retirement and the loss of the pilot identity that defined him. The FBI later discovered that he had told hotel staff in New York that this might be the last time you see me, a clear indicator of suicidal ideation that was never communicated to his employer. He realized that the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean provided a permanent graveyard where his motives could be buried under miles of water and decades of diplomatic bickering. The Battuti case remains a chilling example of professional parasitism. He used his status as a senior officer to bypass the safety check of a two-man cockpit, turning a routine relief shift into a mass execution. It highlighted the danger of the seniority shield, where a pilot's long career is used to deflect suspicion of psychological instability or misconduct. The system failure was the assumption that religious devotion and a long service record were sufficient substitutes for rigorous, ongoing psychological evaluation. Today, Flight 990 is remembered as a closed loop of tragedy and denial. Al-Battuti didn't leave a note. He left a recording of a prayer that became a weapon. He is a reminder that the most dangerous system failures aren't always in the wiring or the engines, but in the human software that can crash a plane long before it hits the ground. While the NTSB eventually closed the case, the 11 repetitions of "I rely on God" stand as a testament to the fact that when a pilot decides to check out, they often take everyone else's boarding pass with them. Case 3. David Burke. The evidence that reconstructed the final moments of PSA Flight 1771 on December 7, 1987, came not from a flight recorder alone, but from a crumpled air sickness bag found in the wreckage. In the world of aviation, system failure usually refers to a hydraulic leak or an engine flameout. But this case was a masterclass in the security buffer failure. While the FAA focused on screening passengers for metal objects, they had created an infrastructure of elite access for airline employees that bypassed the very checkpoints meant to protect the public. The primary witness was a .44 Magnum, a weapon that should never have made it past the terminal gate. David Burke, a disgruntled former employee of US Air, didn't just breach a cockpit. He breached the institutional trust that allowed a badge to act as a universal key to a pressurized tomb. David Augustus Burke was born on May 18, 1952, in Jamaica, and moved to the United States as a young man, where he eventually found work in the high-stakes fog of the airline industry. By 1987, he was a customer service agent for US Air in Los Angeles, but his internal foundation was fractured by a history of petty theft and professional instability. To his coworkers, he was a man with a simmering fuse, but to the legal system, he was an administrative ghost who had managed to stay just under the radar. When he was caught stealing $69 from the airline's cocktail receipts, his supervisor, Raymond Thompson, refused to grant him leniency and terminated his employment. Burke didn't see this as a consequence of his actions. He saw it as a social execution that demanded a reciprocal response. The institutional failure began at the employee entrance of Los Angeles International Airport. Burke, despite being fired, had not yet surrendered his credentials. He utilized his employee bypass to carry a concealed, large-caliber handgun past security, realizing that the badge culture of the 1980s was an invisible shield. He knew exactly which flight his former boss, Raymond Thompson, would be taking to San Francisco. PSA Flight 1771 was a British Aerospace 146, a quiet trader jet that would soon become a laboratory for Burke's technical revenge. He didn't just want to kill his boss, he wanted to dismantle the entire system that had rejected him. The technical execution began at 22,000 feet over the central coast of California. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, captured the sound of 2 gunshots in the cabin, the sound of Burke finalizing his administrative debt with Raymond Thompson. He didn't stop there. He knew that for his terminal revenge to be complete, the aircraft itself had to become a weapon. Burke burst into the cockpit, shouting, "I'm the problem," before shooting both pilots. This was the ultimate cockpit culture failure, a situation where the pilots, trained for mechanical emergencies, were completely defenseless against an internal security breach from their own ranks. Burke's forensic premeditation was chillingly documented on that air sickness bag. He had written a note to Thompson during the flight. "Hi Ray, I think it's sort of ironical that we end up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family. Remember? Well, I got none and you'll get none." This wasn't a cry for help. It was a technical manifesto. By shooting the pilots and pushing the control columns forward, Burke initiated a vertical dive that surpassed the aircraft's structural limits. The jet struck the ground at a speed faster than sound, creating a crater so deep and a debris field so pulverized that investigators initially thought the plane had vanished into thin air. The administrative failure of the PSA 1771 case was the realization that the airline had no real-time protocol for deactivating employee credentials. Burke was a decommissioned predator who was still operating with active permissions. The system assumed that a badge holder was inherently safe, a blind spot that ignored the psychological volatility of a terminated employee with a grudge. He realized that the terminal wasn't a fortress. It was a sieve, for those who knew which doors were left unlocked for the staff. The Burke case forced a total regulatory overhaul of airport security. It led to the immediate requirement that all airline employees, including pilots and flight attendants, submit to the same security screening as passengers. It also mandated the immediate surrender of all credentials upon termination, closing the access loophole that Burke had exploited. The institutional failure was the belief that an airline uniform was a substitute for a background check. It was a hard-learned lesson that the internal threat is often more dangerous than the external one. Today, David Burke is remembered as the architect of the employee bypass disaster. He didn't use a bomb or a complicated plot. He used a badge and a grievance. He is a reminder that when we build security buffers that exclude certain groups based on trust, we create an infrastructure of vulnerability. While modern airports are now some of the most secure environments on Earth, the pulverized remains of Flight 1771 stand as a testament to the fact that the most dangerous system failure is the one that allows a predator to walk through the front door with a smile and a badge. Case 4. Joseph Emerson. In October 2023, the pressurized silence of an Alaska Airlines cockpit became the site of a cognitive system failure that nearly resulted in the mid-air execution of 83 people. While the aviation industry has spent decades perfecting the technical redundancy of engines and hydraulics, it remains dangerously vulnerable to the jumpseat loophole, a professional courtesy that allows off-duty pilots to travel in the cockpit as trusted observers. On Flight 2059, this infrastructure of elite access was exploited not by a hijacker, but by a veteran captain who had been categorized as safe by every institutional metric. Joseph Emerson didn't need to break down the door. He was already inside the fortress, utilizing a psychological blind spot that the industry had long ignored in its quest for mechanical perfection. Joseph David Emerson was born on April 7, 1979, and spent over 2 decades climbing the rigid hierarchy of commercial aviation, eventually earning the rank of captain with Alaska Airlines. To his neighbors in Pleasant Hill, California, he was the mask of stability, a friendly father and a dedicated professional who coached youth sports. However, behind this professional shield was a man experiencing a catastrophic mental health fog. Following the sudden death of a close friend, Emerson began a descent into untreated depression and anxiety. Because the FAA's administrative rigidity often results in the immediate grounding and loss of livelihood for pilots who report mental health struggles, Emerson chose the path of forensic concealment. He hid his symptoms, fearing that the system designed to protect passengers would destroy his career if he spoke the truth. The institutional failure reached its tipping point on October 22, 2023. Emerson, struggling with a 40-hour bout of insomnia and the lingering effects of a technical experiment with psychedelic mushrooms, boarded a flight from Everett to San Francisco. He utilized his badge authority to claim the cockpit jump seat, a position mere inches from the critical controls. The pilots on duty treated him with the professional deference afforded to a peer, never realizing that they were inviting a chemical saboteur into their sterile workspace. Emerson wasn't a stranger. He was a vetted insider whose presence was sanctioned by the very security protocols meant to keep the cockpit secure. The technical execution occurred at 31,000 feet. Without warning, Emerson uttered the phrase, "I'm not okay," and lunged for the T-handle fire suppression toggles. This was a critical system attack. Pulling those handles would have instantly starved both engines of fuel, turning the Embraer 175 into a 40-ton glider over the rugged terrain of Oregon. It was only through the manual intervention of the on-duty pilots, who physically wrestled Emerson's hands away from the toggles, that the engines remained ignited. The struggle was a tactical siege in a space no larger than a walk-in closet, where the trust-based infrastructure of the cockpit was shattered in a matter of seconds. What Emerson did followed a pattern of internal sabotage, fueled by a sensory distortion. After being subdued and removed from the cockpit, he told flight attendants that he thought he was in a dream and was trying to wake up by crashing the plane. The technical weapon in this case was the aviation medical fog, the industry-wide culture of silence that prevents pilots from seeking psychiatric help. Emerson realized that if he reported his grief or his experimentation with psilocybin, the regulatory guillotine of the FAA would end his 20-year career. He was a functional pilot on paper, but a catastrophic risk in reality, shielded by a system that prioritizes clean records over honest mental health recovery. The pattern finally broke through a system correction initiated by the quick-thinking crew. Emerson was restrained in the back of the plane, where he continued to exhibit psychotic detachment, even attempting to open an emergency exit during the descent. Upon landing in Portland, he was arrested and initially charged with 83 counts of attempted murder. The administrative failure was the realization that there are virtually no real-time psychological checks for off-duty pilots using the jump seat. The system assumes that if a pilot has a valid medical certificate, they are sanitized for entry into the flight deck, regardless of their current emotional or chemical state. In late 2023, the charges against Emerson were reduced from attempted murder to reckless endangerment after a grand jury heard evidence regarding his psychological break. The defense argued that Emerson was not a cold-blooded killer, but a victim of a systemic stigma that forced him to hide a mental breakdown until it turned into a tactical crisis. Throughout the legal proceedings, Emerson has become a polarizing symbol of the need for pilot mental health reform. He remains under strict judicial supervision, while the aviation community debates how to reform the administrative ghost of pilot psychological monitoring. The Emerson case resulted in a massive industry-wide conversation regarding the jump seat protocol. It led to calls for more robust, non-punitive mental health reporting systems, allowing pilots to step away from the controls without permanently losing their licenses. It also highlighted the forensic risk of the growing psychedelic underground, as more professionals turn to unregulated substances to treat the burnout and trauma associated with high-stakes careers. The system failure was the belief that a pilot's professional mask is an impenetrable barrier against human fragility. Joseph Emerson didn't have the violent manifestos of a terrorist. He had a grief-induced psychosis and a jump seat pass. He is a reminder that the most dangerous technical failure in an aircraft isn't a cracked turbine, it's a cracked mind. The irony of his case was that his attempt to wake up from a nightmare nearly created a permanent one for 83 families. He remains a cautionary tale for an industry that has mastered the mechanics of flight, but is still struggling to navigate the atmospheric turbulence of the human psyche. Case 5, Zuhari Shah. In March 2014, the vast expanse of the southern Indian Ocean became the final resting place for a digital ghost that vanished from the world's radar in a masterclass of technical erasure. While the aviation industry had spent decades building global tracking infrastructure designed to ensure no aircraft could ever truly disappear, it was compromised not by a mechanical failure, but by a command-level sabotage. On Malaysia, Airlines Flight 370. This infrastructure was dismantled from the inside by a man who knew exactly where the blind spots were. Captain Zuhairi Shah didn't just crash a plane. He orchestrated a logistical vanishing act that exploited the fragmented nature of international air traffic control, turning a Boeing 777 into a 250-ton shadow. Zuhairi Ahmad Shah was born on July 31st, 1961, and was a veteran senior statesman of Malaysia Airlines with over 18,000 flight hours and a reputation as a pilot's pilot. To his colleagues, he was a dedicated professional who spent his free time building a sophisticated, high-end flight simulator in his home. However, behind this professional shield was a man reportedly dealing with the fog of personal instability and a fractured marriage. To the public, he was the face of Malaysian aviation excellence. To forensic investigators, he would later become a tactical enigma. This dual identity allowed him to maintain the mask of authority while he allegedly plotted a final detour that would baffle the world's greatest forensic minds for over a decade. The institutional failure occurred at the handover point between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. At 1:19 a.m., a final calm voice transmission, "Good night, Malaysian 370, marked the beginning of a manual redaction. Minutes later, the aircraft's transponder was manually switched off, rendering the plane invisible to civilian secondary radar. This was the ultimate systemic exploitation. Shah knew that by going dark at the exact moment of a jurisdictional handover, he could create a temporal buffer where neither country was officially tracking the flight. He utilized the bureaucratic gap of international aviation to vanish in Sigadil, plain sight. The technical execution involved a series of precise, high-altitude maneuvers that required expert-level knowledge of the Boeing 767 systems. Military radar later revealed that the plane made a sharp left turn, doubling back over the Malay Peninsula before heading toward the Andaman Sea. This wasn't a random descent. It was a calculated evasion. By hugging the border between different radar sectors, the pilot ensured that military controllers on both sides would assume the unidentified blip was the other country's responsibility. The technical weapon was the pilot's intimate understanding of tactical airspace, using the very maps he studied for work to find a path to oblivion. What Shah allegedly did followed a pattern of digital premeditation. When the FBI later analyzed the hard drives from his home flight simulator, they discovered a forensic breadcrumb that the Malaysian government initially tried to suppress. Shah had used the simulator to practice a flight path deep into the southern Indian Ocean, a path that almost perfectly mirrored the final arc calculated by satellite pings. This was a blueprint for erasure. He had rehearsed the end of his life and the lives of 238 others, testing the fuel endurance of the aircraft to ensure it would reach the most remote, deepest part of the ocean, where recovery would be nearly impossible. The pattern remained hidden through an administrative failure that spanned multiple nations. For weeks, the search was focused on the South China Sea, while the logistical ghost was already thousands of miles away. The technical failure was the realization that while we can track a cell phone to a single room, a massive commercial airliner could still hide in the analog gaps of the ocean. The system assumed that a pilot would always want to be found, a blind spot that ignored the possibility of a suicidal architect who wanted to be remembered as a mystery rather than a murderer. The MH370 case resulted in a total global tracking mandate. It led to the requirement for aircraft to transmit their position every 15 minutes and every minute in the event of an emergency, closing the vanishing loophole that Shah exploited. It also highlighted the forensic limitation of black boxes, leading to the development of deployable recorders and real-time data streaming. The institutional failure was the belief that seniority and a clean record were an absolute guarantee of psychological stability. Zuhari Shah didn't leave a manifesto. He left a logistical puzzle that has cost hundreds of millions of dollars to solve. He is a reminder that the most dangerous system failure is a pilot who decides to turn the science of flight into a science of disappearance. The irony of his case was that his attempt to vanish perfectly was undone by a series of handshake pings with a satellite, a technical oversight that provided the only map to his watery grave. He remains the ultimate logistical ghost, a man who spent his life navigating the skies only to use them as a shroud for a secret he took to the bottom of the sea. Case 6, Herminio dos Santos Fernandes. In November 2013, the remote wilderness of the Boabwada National Park became the site of a cockpit isolation disaster that served as a grim, unheeded precursor to the Germanwings tragedy. While the global aviation community was focused on the external threat of terrorism, a system failure was unfolding in the skies over southern Africa, where the very security measures designed to protect the flight deck were being used to facilitate a mass execution. On LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470, the infrastructure of concealment was not a hidden room, but a lockout protocol that allowed a senior pilot to turn a modern Embraer 190 into a high-speed coffin. Captain Herminio dos Santos Fernandes didn't just crash a plane. He utilized a regulatory blind spot to ensure that his final descent was as uninterrupted as it was intentional. Herminio dos Santos Fernandes was born in 1964 and was a veteran of the Mozambican aviation industry, carrying the mask of professionalism that comes with decades of service and thousands of flight hours. To his peers, he was a standard bearer for the national carrier. However, behind this professional shield was a man whose personal life was in a state of catastrophic decay. Following the death of his son and a protracted, bitter divorce, Fernandes was experiencing a psychological collapse that went entirely undetected by his airline. To the 27 passengers and 6 crew members on board, he was the ultimate authority. To the forensic investigators who would later examine his life, he was a grief-stricken saboteur who had reached his breaking point in total isolation. The institutional failure occurred during a routine leg from Maputo to Luanda. When the co-pilot left the cockpit to use the lavatory, Fernandes initiated a manual redaction of the aircraft's safety. He engaged the door's lock override, a post-9/11 security feature, ensuring that even with an emergency code, the co-pilot could not re-enter. This was the ultimate systemic exploitation. Fernandes utilized a protocol meant to keep hijackers out, to keep his only potential savior away from the controls. He then manually adjusted the altitude selector from 38,000 feet to just 592 feet, a height lower than the surrounding terrain. The technical execution was captured on the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, as a series of rhythmic metallic thuds. These were the sounds of the co-pilot frantically beating on the cockpit door, a tactical siege that Fernandes ignored with chilling resolve. Military-grade forensics later showed that Fernandes didn't just set a lower altitude. He manually manipulated the autothrottle and the spoilers to increase the rate of descent, essentially forcing the plane toward Earth. The technical weapon, in this case, was the pilot's intimate knowledge of the Embraer's automation, using the very systems designed for flight envelope protection to override any mechanical resistance to the crash. What Fernandes did followed a pattern of silent premeditation. As the plane plummeted toward the Namibian bush, he remained completely silent, ignoring the sink rate and pull-up warnings that filled the cockpit. This wasn't a momentary lapse, it was a calculated termination. Investigators found that he had manually adjusted the altitude settings 3 separate times during the descent, ensuring that the aircraft stayed on its fatal trajectory. He was a command-level ghost, operating the plane with a level of precision that proved he was fully conscious and aware of the human toll his actions were taking. The pattern remained hidden through an administrative failure that initially categorized the disappearance as a weather-related incident. Because the crash occurred in a sparsely populated national park during a rainstorm, it took nearly 24 hours for search teams to locate the forensic graveyard. The technical failure was the global community's inability to learn from the breadcrumbs Fernandez left behind. If the industry had analyzed the lockout risk of Flight 47 in 2013, the 2-person rule might have been implemented in time to prevent Andreas Lubitz from repeating the exact same maneuver 2 years later. The LAM Flight 470 case resulted in a localized regulatory overhaul in Mozambique, but its global impact was tragically muted by geographic indifference. It highlighted the forensic risk of the single pilot cockpit during crew breaks, proving that even a highly decorated captain can become a systemic threat. The institutional failure was the assumption that a pilot's grief was a private matter, ignoring the fact that a broken mind at the controls is more dangerous than a broken engine. Herminio dos Santos Fernandes didn't leave a suicide note. He left a mechanical blueprint for mass murder. He is a reminder that the most dangerous system failures are often ignored until they happen in a more visible jurisdiction. The irony of his case was that he utilized the world's most advanced cockpit security to commit a crime that the system was never designed to stop. He remains a shadow in the skies, a man who used his final moments to prove that when a pilot decides to lock the world out, the world has no way of getting back in. Case 7. TSU Wei Ming. In December 1997, the Musi River in Indonesia became the site of a kinetic system failure, so violent that it challenged the very laws of subsonic aviation. While the industry was focused on the technical reliability of the newly minted Boeing 737-300, a financial collapse was unfolding in the cockpit, where a veteran pilot was treating his aircraft not as a transport vessel, but as a tool of erasure. On Silk Air Flight 185, the infrastructure of concealment was a series of manually pulled circuit breakers that rendered the plane's black boxes blind just minutes before a terminal plunge. Captain Su Wei Ming didn't just crash a plane. He utilized a professional shield to execute a maneuver so extreme that the aircraft broke the sound barrier before it even hit the water. Su Wei Ming was born in 1956 and was a command-level asset for Silk Air, a man whose identity was forged in the elite world of the Singaporean Air Force's Black Knights aerobatic team. To his colleagues, he was a disciplinarian and a high flyer. However, behind this professional mask was a man drowning in a logistical crisis. Following a series of disastrous day trading losses on the stock market and a recent disciplinary demotion at work, Su was experiencing a social execution that he could not afford to sustain. To the 97 passengers on board, he was a symbol of Singaporean precision. To the Tiwu forensic investigators who would later reconstruct his finances, he was a market-broken predator who had run out of options. The institutional failure occurred as the flight reached its cruising altitude over Sumatra. In a move that signaled forensic premeditation, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, suddenly went dead. Analysis later proved that the circuit breaker for the recorder had been manually pulled from the cockpit. 6 minutes later, the flight data recorder, FDR, was also silenced. This was the ultimate manual redaction. Tsu utilized his intimate knowledge of the 737's electrical systems to ensure that his final actions would leave no digital fingerprints. He turned the aircraft into a forensic void before initiating the dive. The technical execution was a masterpiece of aerodynamic brutality. The plane didn't just fall, it was driven into a vertical nosedive so steep that it exceeded the structural limits of the airframe. Witnesses on the ground described a silver bolt screaming from the sky. The technical weapon in this case was the flight control system, which Tsu used to override the natural stability of the Boeing 737. The aircraft reached Mach 1.2, supersonic speeds, causing pieces of the tail and wings to shear off from the sheer pressure before the main fuselage disintegrated into the river. What Tsu allegedly did followed a pattern of high-stakes sabotage. Just days before the flight, he had taken out a $600,000 life insurance policy to protect his family from his mounting debts, a policy that would only pay out if his death was an accident. This was his financial blueprint. By disabling the black boxes, he hoped to create enough administrative fog to prevent a finding of suicide, ensuring his family's survival at the cost of 103 lives. He was a risk management ghost, calculating the value of human life against the balance of his bank account. The pattern remained hidden through an administrative failure of international proportions. The Indonesian NTSB, facing political pressure and a lack of black box data, officially ruled the cause as undetermined. However, the American NTSB issued a stinging dissent, utilizing kinetic reconstruction to prove that the dive could only have been achieved through sustained manual pilot input. The technical failure was the industry's refusal to admit that a suicidal ace could bypass every onboard recording system with a simple flick of a switch. The Silk Air 185 case resulted in a hardware overhaul for the global 737 fleet. It led to the redesign of non-pullable circuit breakers for flight recorders, closing the manual erasure loophole that Tsu exploited. It also highlighted the forensic risk of high-status pilots facing extreme financial pressure, proving that credit scores can be as important to flight safety as flight hours. The institutional failure was the belief that military discipline was an absolute safeguard against civilian desperation. Tsu Wei-ming didn't leave a note. He left a supersonic signature in the mud of the Musi River. He is a reminder that the most dangerous system failures are often fueled by the silent pressures of the world outside the cockpit. The irony of his case was that his attempt to hide his motive through a black box blackout became the very evidence that pointed toward his guilt. He remains a specter of the sound barrier, a man who used the ultimate precision of flight to orchestrate a total, anonymous erasure. Case 8. Lyle Prowse. In March 1990, the flight deck of a Boeing 727 departing from Fargo, North Dakota, became the site of a regulatory system failure that challenged the aviation industry's code of silence. While the public trusted that the three-pilot system provided a triple redundancy against human error, on Northwest Flight 227, the infrastructure was compromised by a cultural blind spot regarding substance abuse. This wasn't a case of a single pilot slipping through the cracks. It was a collective institutional failure, where an entire crew operated a 150,000-pound aircraft while profoundly intoxicated. Captain Lyle Prowse didn't crash the plane into the ground, but he crashed the professional shield of the American pilot, leading to the first-ever criminal conviction of a commercial flight crew for operating under the influence in United States history. Lyle Prowse was born in 1938 and was a decorated Vietnam War veteran with a command-level resume that commanded immediate respect within Northwest Airlines. To his colleagues, he was a pilot's pilot, tough, experienced, and authoritative. However, behind this mask of competence was a man struggling with a long-term, functional battle with alcoholism. On the night of March 7th, 1990, during a layover in Fargo, Prowse and his 2 crew members consumed nearly 20 pitchers of beer and several mixed drinks at a local lounge, ending their session just 6 hours before their scheduled departure. This logistical negligence was facilitated by a professional culture that often looked the other way, assuming that elite skill could override chemical impairment. The institutional failure occurred at the security checkpoint and the boarding gate. Despite smelling of stale alcohol and appearing disheveled to a ground crew member who eventually called the FAA, the crew was allowed to board the aircraft. There was no technical barrier, no breathalyzer interlocks, or mandatory pre-flight checks to prevent an impaired pilot from sitting in the command seat. Prowse utilized his authority bias to lead his first officer and flight engineer onto the plane, effectively enabling a crew-wide collapse of safety protocols. They flew 58 passengers to Minneapolis at 30,000 feet, a technical miracle only made possible by the aircraft's automation and the pilot's deeply ingrained muscle memory. The technical execution of the flight was surprisingly routine, which served as the most terrifying aspect of the case. It proved that a pilot could be functionally blacked out while still operating complex machinery, creating a forensic mirage of safety. Upon landing in Minneapolis, the crew was met by FAA inspectors and police. Prowse's blood alcohol level was measured at 0.13%, nearly twice the legal limit for driving at the time, and over 3 times the FAA's bottle-to-throttle limit of 0.04%. This was an administrative breach that proved the honor system was no longer sufficient to protect the traveling public. What Prowse did followed a pattern of professional denial. During his trial, the defense attempted to argue that his high tolerance meant he wasn't technically impaired, a technical lie that the court soundly rejected. This was a landmark case because it stripped away the forensic invisibility that had protected alcoholic pilots for decades. The prosecution utilized the crew's bar tab and eyewitness testimony from the lounge to build a timeline of negligence that left no room for administrative fog. The pattern broke with a judicial correction. In July 1990, Lyle Prowse, First Officer Robert Kirchner, and flight engineer Joseph Balzer were convicted in a federal court in Minneapolis. Prowse was sentenced to 16 months in federal prison, becoming the first commercial pilot to serve time for flying drunk. The institutional failure was further highlighted when Prowse was stripped of his licenses and fired, marking a social execution that sent shockwaves through the Airline Pilots Association, OMERTÁ. The Northwest 227 case resulted in a massive industry-wide reformation. It led to the implementation of mandatory random drug and alcohol testing for all transport sector employees in the U.S. under the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991. It also revolutionized the HIMS, Human Intervention Motivation Study, program, shifting the focus from punishment to identification and recovery, allowing pilots to seek help for addiction before they reach the cockpit. The system failure was the belief that a pilot's uniform made them immune to the frailties of addiction. Lyle Prowse eventually became a symbol of redemption. After serving his prison sentence and achieving sobriety, he fought a 10-year legal battle to regain his licenses and was eventually rehired by Northwest Airlines. retiring as a captain in 1998. He even received a full presidential pardon from Bill Clinton in 2001. He is a reminder that while the professional shield can be used to hide a crisis, the true strength of a system is its ability to correct its failures and offer a path back from the brink. Case 9. Christian Kit Martin. In November 2015, a quiet cornfield in Christian County, Kentucky, became the site of a security buffer failure that proved the most dangerous threat to an institution is the one it refuses to acknowledge. While American Airlines and its subsidiary, PSA, were focused on flight deck reliability, they were unknowingly employing a man who had already been flagged for psychological volatility and criminal conduct. Christian Kit Martin, a senior pilot and former Army major, didn't use an aircraft to commit his crimes. He utilized his tactical expertise and the institutional blind spot of the aviation industry to execute a triple homicide. By the time he was arrested in May 2019, literally at the boarding gate of a flight he was about to command, he had exposed a regulatory void where a badge and a uniform acted as a shield for a predator. Christian Richard Martin was born in 1971 and spent 30 years building a mask of authority through a dual career in the U.S. Army and commercial aviation. To the passengers on his regional jets, he was the voice of calm and control. To his neighbors in the small town of Pembroke, he was a simmering fuse engaged in a bitter, high-stakes dispute with those living next door. In 2016, while he was still flying for PSA Airlines, Martin was court-martialed and dismissed from the Army for mishandling classified information and assault. This was the first major administrative failure. Despite this punitively dismissed status, the military equivalent of a dishonorable discharge, Martin remained in the cockpit. The aviation industry's background check protocol failed to classify his military crimes as disqualifying felonies, allowing a decommissioned predator to maintain active permissions. The victims Martin targeted were his neighbors, 59-year-old Calvin Phillips, his 58-year-old wife Pamela, and their 63-year-old neighbor, Edward Dansereau. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a logistical termination. Calvin Phillips was scheduled to testify as a witness in Martin's military court-martial, making him a systemic obstacle that Martin decided to remove. On November 18, 2015, Martin utilized his tactical premeditation to invade the Phillips home. Calvin was shot to death in his cellar. Pamela and Edward were kidnapped, shot, and their bodies were placed in a car that was then incinerated in a nearby field. This forensic erasure, the use of arson to destroy biological evidence, was a hallmark of a killer who understood how to disrupt a technical investigation. What Martin did followed a pattern of digital and physical invisibility. Following the murders, he continued to fly commercial passengers across the United States for nearly 4 years. He utilized the professional shield of his pilot's uniform to project an image of stability while the Kentucky State Police painstakingly pieced together a forensic map of his movements. The technical weapon in the investigation wasn't just ballistics, it was the administrative paperwork and witness testimonies that Martin had tried to silence. Investigators eventually linked shell casings found at the scene to a weapon owned by Martin, breaking through his mask of innocence. The pattern finally broke with a high-visibility arrest on May 11, 2019. In a scene that mirrored a security breach protocol, Martin was taken into custody at the Louisville International Airport, just as he was preparing to pilot a flight to Charlotte. The institutional failure was laid bare. The airline admitted that while his assault conviction had appeared on his background check, it had been listed as a simple assault, allowing him to pass the secure identification display area SIDA, check. He was a verified insider who had been operating within the most secure areas of American infrastructure while being the primary suspect in a triple homicide. Christian Martin was convicted on June 16, 2021, in a Kentucky courtroom. The prosecution presented the evidence of retaliatory logic, proving that Martin had killed to protect his career and his reputation. Throughout the trial, Martin maintained a stoic detachment, a remnant of his tactical training. He was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, arson, burglary, and tampering with physical evidence. Judge John Atkins sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the tactical predator would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The Kit Martin case resulted in a background check overhaul for regional airlines. It exposed the data gap between military court-martials and civilian employment screening, leading to calls for more integrated security databases that catch dismissed officers before they enter the civilian workforce. The system failure was the belief that a uniformed professional is inherently trustworthy, even when their own record is screaming with warning signs. Christian Martin is currently serving his life sentence at the Kentucky State Penitentiary. He didn't crash a plane into a building. He crashed the system of trust that allows a pilot to be seen as a protector rather than a threat. He is a reminder that the most dangerous internal threat is the one that has been vetted and approved by a system that refuses to look past the surface of a polished uniform. Case 10. Joseph Sanders. In October 1997, a residential complex in Minneapolis, Minnesota, became the site of a security perimeter breach that proved the most dangerous weapon in a pilot's arsenal. Isn't a plane, but the tactical patience learned in the cockpit. While the aviation industry was refining crew resource management to prevent accidents, Joseph Sanders was using his training to execute a targeted strike against those he perceived as personal enemies. He didn't need a flight deck to manifest his command-level authority. He utilized a professional shield to move through society undetected until the moment he opened fire. By the time the forensic reconstruction was complete, Sanders had turned a domestic dispute into a ballistic system failure that left 1 dead and 2 others permanently scarred. Joseph Sanders was a man who lived a dual-track existence. To his employers and colleagues, he was a focused, technically proficient pilot. However, behind this mask of competence was a man who reacted to social friction with lethal force. Following a series of escalating verbal altercations with a group of acquaintances, Sanders entered a state of psychological redline. Instead of utilizing the conflict resolution skills taught to every commercial pilot, he opted for a tactical solution. On October 5, 1997, he bypassed the administrative safety of civil society and transitioned into the role of a ballistic predator. The victims were 16-year-old innocent bystander and 2 adults who were the primary targets of his rage. This wasn't a random shooting. It was a calculated interdiction. Sanders arrived at the apartment building with a firearm and a mission-oriented mindset. He opened fire outside the building, utilizing the technical advantage of surprise and a high-capacity weapon. The institutional failure, in this case, was the assumption that a man vetted for the high-responsibility role of a pilot would possess the emotional governor required to prevent a violent outburst. Sanders proved that a clean background check is a snapshot of the past, not a guarantee of future stability. What Sanders did followed a pattern of retaliatory logic. In the aftermath, he attempted to create a forensic fog by fleeing the scene and disposing of the weapon, a manual redaction of his involvement. However, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension utilized trajectory analysis and eyewitness digital breadcrumbs to link Sanders to the crime. The technical weapon used against him in court was the consistency of the ballistics evidence, which proved that the shots were fired with a level of precision that matched the focus required in his professional life. The pattern finally broke during his trial in 1999. The prosecution presented a case of premeditated execution, arguing that Sanders had deliberately sought out his victims to settle a logistical grudge. The jury rejected any claims of momentary lapse, seeing instead a command-level decision to kill. The institutional failure was highlighted by the shock of the local aviation community, which had seen Sanders as a low-risk individual. Joseph Sanders was convicted in 1999 of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, plus 2 consecutive 180-month, 15-year sentences for the attempted murders. Unlike many of the pilots in this series who died in their cockpits, Sanders became a permanent resident of the administrative void of the Minnesota Department of Corrections. His various appeals, including a major one in 2024 and 2025, have all been denied, with the court's ruling that his sentences correctly reflected the technical severity of his crimes. The Joseph Sanders case resulted in a cultural re-evaluation within regional flight schools and small carriers in the Midwest. It highlighted the forensic risk of ignoring personal conduct outside the workplace. It proved that a pilot's license is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, and that the science of flight can never excuse the science of murder. The system failure was the belief that professional achievement is a shield against criminal accountability. Joseph Sanders remains incarcerated, serving his life term plus 30 years. He didn't use a Boeing to commit his crime, but he used the mask of a pilot to hide the heart of a killer. He is the final reminder in this series that the most dangerous system failure isn't a mechanical part. It's the human being who knows how to fly the system right up until the moment they decide to break it.